Welcome everyone to Global Pills. This is Giovanni Gruni. This is the second part of the interview to Dmitry Grozoubinski. The first part was published last week and is available on the Global Pills podcast website, plus on all other podcasting platforms. In your paper, you refer also to the three pillars of the WTO. What do you mean exactly?
Sure. So we've talked a little bit about disputes already. This is the part of the WTO's function when two members disagree about what the rules mean or how one another's implementing the rules. And so a pillar of the WTO is resolving those in a mutually satisfactory way. That is one part of its work. A second part of its work is negotiations. The WTO is effectively an umbrella body under which sit a number of international trade agreements. These cover things like the GATT, which covers goods, the GATS, which covers services, there's TRIPS, which covers intellectual property, all sorts of agreements, the agreements on customs valuation, on how you're supposed to value a good at the border, a whole range of agreements. In order to create into new agreements that the entire WTO will be party to, you have to negotiate them. A core principle of the WTO is that it operates on consensus. No one is ever subject to anything that they did not agree to or sign up to. So if you want to change some part of an international agreement, like say the agreement on agriculture, you don't like what it says about subsidies, and you want to change that aspect of international trade law, you have to negotiate with the other 163 members of the World Trade Organization. The same applies if you want to create an entirely new agreement. You want to create an agreement on, say, electronic commerce, and you want it to apply to the entirety of the WTO. That is a negotiation. It's a 164-way negotiation. So the WTO exists to create, I suppose, a forum and a structure and kind of all of the administrative and research support to let representatives and diplomats from all of those WTO members negotiate on new trade rules. On the whole, they have been wildly unsuccessful at doing that, it must be said, in the last 20 years, because unsurprisingly, it is very hard to get 164 different members to agree on literally anything. And finally, there's a really important function of compliance and monitoring, which is a part of the WTO's work not many people pay attention to, but it actually makes a really big difference. So there are all of these agreements I have been describing, and the WTO creates forums and committees for each of those agreements and each of the things that it covers, where WTO members can come together and basically provide transparency about their own policies and ask questions of others about their policies. So you can, in the Committee on Agriculture, ask the United States a question about its export financing regime. And they are supposed to engage with that and explain what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they think it's compliant with WTO law. It's a great place for countries and their representatives to bring really technical issues that are hurting their businesses in another country and say, hey, listen, the way that you are treating our mung beans at the port, at this particular port is really discriminatory and unfair, and it's contrary to the rules. Could you do something about it? Or could you explain this law that is coming down through your parliament in your country that on our reading would really hurt our exporters in an unfair way? Could you explain it to us? What are you trying to do? How is this congruent with your obligations? And would you be open to making some changes to it to make sure that it doesn't break the rules and it doesn't hurt our exporters in a way that maybe you never intended it to? So there's a tremendous amount of work that goes on the WTO to basically just collect information, exchange information, and enter into technical discussions on how 164 different governments are applying trade policy domestically and at the border to make that transparent, to query it, and to push for changes in one another's trade law without a big formal agreement.
And you see crises in each one of these pillars.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. We've already discussed the WTO dispute settlement crisis, this appellate body falling over. Now, the European Union and a range of other members have put in place something temporary to replace it among themselves. And they've taken some steps to try to sort of staunch this bleeding, this absence. But at the end of the day, it is a real crisis. It is a problem because the WTO is meant to apply to all 164 members. And without an appellate body, it only really applies that level to those who have signed up to this EU regime. So there's a crisis in that dispute pillar. The negotiation pillar has been in some semblance of crisis pretty much for 20 years. There are a bunch of economic and technical reasons for that, but the WTO rules as they were created and agreed in 94 were supposed to be just the start. They were written in a way where the vision was that they would agree to this package of rules and concessions, and then they would build on them. They would liberalize further. All of the members would come and make concessions and negotiate more and more liberalized rules to get rid of some of these distortions in trade. Basically, none of that happened. The WTO has agreed very, very little as a global body in those 20 years. It did something called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which wasn't hugely transformative, I think it's fair to say, and refers to sort of procedures and technicalities of customs and at the border. And it ended export subsidies in agriculture, which most members had ceased using long ago. So apart from that, it hasn't, as a multilateral body, negotiated massive new tariff cuts, significantly curbed subsidies in agriculture, which are to the tune of tens of billions of dollars annually. So it hasn't really made progress there, and it's very, very, very deadlocked. Even on very, very urgent, but perhaps not hugely commercially significant areas like fisheries subsidies or establishing some basic rules on electronic commerce. We're trying to move the investment agenda forward, domestic regulation and services. A multilateral outcome still seems really far away. So that's a crisis in the negotiation pillar. And in the transparency and monitoring pillar, there's been a crisis brewing for quite some time because increasingly there's a feeling that members aren't meeting their obligations. They're either not being honest in explaining their regime, or they are being very, very tardy to do it. So there's an issue with members which are supposed to every year or at most every 2 years submit a bunch of documentation to all of the membership through the WTO to say, for example, this is what my agricultural subsidy regime looks like. This is what I've spent. This is where it's went, where it's gone. Here's how I categorize it. They are obliged to do that basically every year, but there are no real penalties for not doing so beyond kind of public condemnation. So a good number of WTO members have fallen very far behind on their notifications and on their transparency. And there is a sense that they are not complying with their obligations and they're not complying with the rules, and that the WTO is powerless to stop them. And so there's this crisis in transparency and monitoring. There's also, I suppose, a concordant crisis in that pillar, which is that a lot of these really technical issues that the WTO compliance mechanism is meant to resolve, this really firm level stuff, is really detailed, and it really needs input from the private sector on the ground. It needs a company in Spain that is exporting to Barbados to notice a problem at the border that doesn't seem quite right, to bring that problem to, say, the government of Spain, that would pass that on to the European Commission through DG Trade, so that DG Trade can formally raise it at the WTO in the appropriate committee. All of that needs to happen, but all of that relies on the firm at the ground level when their exporter or their person on the ground is encountering a difficulty that is discriminatory or unfair or contrary to the rules, knowing that, hey, there's this WTO thing, and that if I know who I can call, I know that if I call the Spanish Ministry of Trade, eventually that will work its way up to DG Trade and it might get addressed at the WTO. That has in a lot of ways broken down as firms have smart-sized out their sort of VP of trade policy and that kind of thing. As they've looked elsewhere, they've looked away from trade policy because it was kind of working. And increasingly, firms don't know even that they can do that or know how to do that. So the WTO, all of this transparency and monitoring and these sort of technical negotiations about individual regulations aren't getting the input from the private sector that they need to be effective. It doesn't matter how good your trade negotiator is, how good your diplomats are, if they don't know what the problem is. And the only way they can learn is if the private sector passes that information up. And that has also broken down. So the committees aren't getting the inputs they need from ground level.
Any glimmers of hope?
Well, things aren't looking great. Something that has emerged semi-recently is across the negotiations pillar. Basically, groups of countries or WTO members have come together and said, okay, if 164 of you can't agree on, say, electronic commerce or domestic regulation and services commitments or investment, what we will do is we will form a subgroup. So we will form a group of, say, initially 30 members that all think some new trade rules around electronic commerce are a really good idea. And we will begin negotiating them amongst ourselves and invite the rest of the membership to join us if they agree and if they want to. And so there are now a number of these initiatives some of them called the joint statement initiatives, where basically a large and growing number of members have said, well, we will work on this issue that has been deadlocked multilaterally, and we will get 70 of us to agree to new rules. And if the rest of the membership wants to sign on to those rules, that's great. Otherwise, we will just apply them, say, amongst ourselves. We'll take on these commitments just amongst ourselves. That's not necessarily fully in the spirit of the WTO, but it is demonstrating some real progress. There's another really important negotiation on fisheries subsidies that has been going for years and years and years and years to basically have members agree not to subsidize illegal fishing and to put in place measures that say that they won't do so. They're going to make sure that if they're subsidizing a fishing fleet, that they've taken steps to make sure that that fishing fleet isn't fishing something it's not supposed to, something that's endangered, or that it's massively overfishing to try to protect international global fish stocks. That negotiation has been ongoing, and it's always like either 6 months away from completion or has no chance at all. But it is seen as a really promising outcome. And if that could be agreed on a multilateral level, that would be really a good sign for the WTO and a real glimmer of hope. But fundamentally, this is a really tough time for the organization. To put it kind of into perspective, the WTO Director General has stepped down, and the membership wasn't even able to agree on an interim Director General from among the 4 Deputy Director Generals to man the helm for the few months until they elect a permanent director general. That's not a great sign for the international trading system.
What would you recommend to overcome the present WTO crisis?
So there's not a huge amount that can be done in the short term, if we're completely honest. At least not through the WTO itself. The reason fundamentally the WTO is in crisis is because a number of very large members, the US being first among them, but far from the only one, no longer fully believe that it, in its current iteration, serves its interests. The US and China are either already in a head-on confrontation that is being called a new Cold War, for lack of a better term, or rapidly heading towards it. And until the US, China, and the European Union arrive through some sort of process, whether that's diplomacy, whether that's confrontation, whatever it is, on a new understanding of how to settle their comparative trade regimes and basically how they're going to divide up the world a little bit and how trade should work. The WTO is going to continue to flounder in these winds as these three giants contest one another. So until those three have arrived at a new kind of global understanding amongst themselves, the WTO is going to be in trouble. Now, there's still positive things that you can do and that should be done. These joint statement initiatives, this attempt to make progress where you can, things like fishery subsidies, domestic regulation and services, whatever can be done to assist trade and development, the women in trade, the women's economic empowerment agenda, all of these things, which are not necessarily the absolute core, most contentious issues of tariffs and agricultural subsidies, all of these should be explored, whether through these what are called plurilaterals, when subgroups of the membership come together. All of those are a really good, I suppose, are a really good way to keep the organization relevant and to keep the lights on and to keep going and to keep making progress where it's possible and to demonstrate that, hey, this can create positive outcomes. So that's kind of recommendation one. Recommendation two is that ministers, especially in these large in large influential members, have to really kind of go back to basics a bit and look at the part of the WTO that they like, which is generally actually predictable tariffs and predictable trade, and try to cordon that off. To basically say, listen, even if in a US-China confrontation world, maybe the rules around anti-dumping as they're agreed in the WTO don't quite work anymore. The US does need more flexibility to use anti-dumping or it's just going to walk away. If that bit doesn't work, okay, maybe we soften that, but the core commitments on, say, everybody's maximum tariffs, we defend those. Those are important. And to try to basically keep those alive until this new order emerges, new balance emerges between these three spheres of the EU, China, and the US, and the rest of the world, a new order. So keeping the nexus of the house standing through this storm until it settles. It's the second recommendation. And the third one, and this is a really tough ask and it's hard to do, but there needs to be a re-engagement of both business and civil society with the international trading system. And that needs to come both from government kind of pushing down to encourage them in, and from the private sector and civil society stepping up too. And I'm both saying, actually, this is important and we have views on this, and getting educated about it, getting smart about it, and getting engaged with government processes that deal with it. And that will require an education campaign from governments It'll require private sector to commit resources. It will require civil society, or at least a lot of it, to become just as wary, but perhaps more constructively wary than they are of the WTO at present. Civil society is generally, when it comes to international trade policy, been very good at highlighting what it shouldn't do, saying that, for example, international trade policy shouldn't interfere with public health, that it shouldn't lead to the exploitation of workers. And they've been very, very good at making that case. Where civil society hasn't necessarily been always as constructive is saying, well, what should it do? What are some trade rules that it could put in place that would be really positive for health, for the environment, and other things? They're very good at doing this in other areas, pushing for example, the Paris Climate Accords. They were very, very good about getting technical and specific about what that should look like. Not necessarily always in the trade space. And fundamentally, trade policy, trade agreements are just agreements between governments. They can do anything. They can be anything. And so civil society, in addition to continuing to firmly defend the things that they think should not be part of trade policy and to defend their defensive interests, have to put some resources into saying, well, let's figure out what we can use these agreements for in order to push something like the promulgation of environmentally friendly technologies, for example. So it has to be a real re-engagement, because fundamentally, when the private sector isn't engaged and civil society isn't massively engaged, then ministers aren't engaged. When the private sector isn't calling up its members of parliament or representatives or lobbying and saying, hey, here's what we want, then the Ministry of Trade doesn't have the information it needs to help businesses export and help businesses grow. So it can't do that part. And ministers say, well, this obviously isn't important enough for me to invest my time into. It's not worth me putting any political capital on the line, because often some of these decisions that they're having to match are potentially unpopular. And if they don't have anyone pushing for them, they say, well, why would I risk a negative headline to do this if business doesn't care? So it starves the beast, this lack of engagement of both specifics and technical details, but it also starves it of political will, ultimately. And that absolutely needs a fix, because as I think the last couple of years, or especially the last year and a bit, have shown, when this system stops working, it stops working in a big way. And when the uncertainty ratchets it up, it suddenly causes massive problems, both for businesses and for ordinary people. And I think, in a sense, businesses and maybe even civil society, because it kind of sort of worked for 20 years, kind of moved on to other things. But to come back to that sewer system analogy I used at the start, it's okay to forget about the sewage system most of the time, but you've got to remember that if it breaks, everything's covered in stuff you don't want to be covered in. So you have to look after it, and you have to engage with it at least enough to keep it on the rails.
What would be the consequences of the WTO not surviving?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's a bit of futurology that's hard to predict, because even what does it mean when you say the WTO doesn't survive? In practice, what it would probably mean is, for example, the US announces that it no longer considers itself bound by the core treaties of the WTO. So it basically says that as far as it's concerned, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade and the others no longer apply to it. And that begins a bit of a domino effect, where a lot of the other members say, well, I really like trade rules, and I think the WTO is good, but I'm not going to be part of an international trading system that places obligations on me that don't apply to the world's largest economy. It would be like if you had a football match and everybody was obeying the rules, and then Messi showed up in Abrams' battle tank. Pretty soon, everybody else would say, well, hey, this is no longer football. Um, and so you would have the situation where members would pull back to some extent. What does that mean? What happens next? It might not immediately be dramatic. The US might pull out and then not immediately change too many things. Maybe it would apply some tariffs on China that it previously hadn't. Maybe it would change. Maybe it would do some more things with subsidies. And initially, there wouldn't perhaps be this giant sort of cataclysmic event that shocks everyone. But what would happen is that investors and business owners and traders the world over would no longer have any guarantee that the trading conditions that exist today will exist next week. If you are a car company that is thinking about where to build its factory, or its series of factories, because that's how car production works. You might have 7 factories that each produce different components, and then they all send those components to be assembled. If you don't know what every country is going to start doing at the border to those car components, to the steel and plastic that goes into them, to the workers' rights of the people, if you don't know any of that, you are likely to become much more defensive and insular. You're going to say, I'm going to put all of the construction, my entire factory complex, my entire network of factories in like one country. So that's potentially you had production in 7 countries, each operating, making the part that they are most efficient at, and generating employment in 7 places while also generating cheaper cars for everyone in the area. You've now got businesses going, well, I can't afford to have a supply chain that looks like that anymore because I don't know what countries are going to do. They no longer consider themselves bound by the rules. So you're going to have investors and I suppose chief strategic officers becoming more and more paranoid. You're going to see work shrink back into confined spaces, more expensive products, less reactive supply chains. You're going to see shortages, and you're going to see price hikes. And it's going to be especially bad as climate change means that, for example, we are going to see more extreme weather around the world, which in practice means that we are going to see more of one region in drought and another region having a fantastic crop. Our ability to survive climate change and to feed the world will more and more rely on predictability and smooth borders and the ability to move food from the part of the world that's having a really good year into the part of the world that is perhaps having a drought or a flood year. All of that requires stable predictability. It requires transparent borders that are bound by the rules, and the WTO underpins all that. Now, what would actually happen if it fell over? Most likely, you would see the world sort of begin to fracture into these spheres, where you would have a sort of WTO light built around an EU core, possibly a smaller WTO emerge around the US and NAFTA and USMCA and its network, perhaps some area of Chinese influence. And all of these blocks would have different rules, different competition approaches. They would be competing with each other in unhealthy ways, and they would be putting up barriers to one another's trade. All in all, it would be a less connected world, a less efficient world, and a less predictable one. All until the world came to its senses and rebuilt.
Many thanks for contributing to Global Pills, Dmitry. We conclude the podcast asking our guests what is, in their opinion, the number one challenge in their area of interest.
So I would say it's actually, in my area of interest, which is trade, it's climate change And specifically, this really interesting challenge of what is effectively emissions outsourcing. So let's say you have a situation where the European Union wants to be really environmentally conscious. They want to do things the right way. And so they put in place regulations inside the European Union that apply a carbon price, that regulate factories and how they produce to make sure that there aren't a lot of carbon emissions. This is all happening. And this is being driven by an electorate that cares about climate change, that votes that way. That what does that do in practice? Well, it raises costs for European factories. It is more expensive to produce something in an environmentally responsible way than it is to produce it in an environmentally negligent way. That's why people are environmentally negligent. They're not just being jerks. They're not Captain Planet villains. They do what is most efficient. So when the European Union starts applying these rules, what happens to global trade? Well, often the manufacturing just moves to countries that don't have these kind of regulations. So they move from a place with a carbon tax to a place without a carbon tax. So what has the EU regulation really done in this case? Well, it hasn't done much for climate, because even though the EU factories are greener, the factories are still churning out smoke somewhere else. So what do you do? Well, the European Union is saying, well, what we might do is apply a tax on the border to basically level things out. If you bring a car in from Indonesia, we calculate how much carbon tax it would have paid had you made it in the European Union, how much carbon it required to cut, and we charge you a tax on it at the border so that you can't get an advantage over European Union producers by being environmentally negligent. Sounds really fair and reasonable, and in a way, and it is. But the challenge from a trade perspective is huge. Because if you're a European producer, you get charged on how much carbon you actually use. You can basically say, hey, look, this is my factory. It runs off solar power. I've got a collector at the top of my chimney that filters carbon out, and then I dispose of it safely. Here are all of the discounts. And the European Union or your government goes, yes, I can see you doing all that. I will charge you a lower carbon tax. Now, what about the Indonesian car that's coming in? They say they're doing the same thing. But does the European Union just take their word for it? Does it say, okay, I believe you? Does it send an inspection team to every single car factory in the world to work out what the carbon price is? Does it require a whole host of documentation that costs money that European Union producers don't have to pay? All of this is the bread and butter of trade. It is how do you make sure that a legitimate goal, in this case, fighting climate change, doesn't lead to just protectionism and charging the Indonesians more than they should be paying to keep them out of the European market just to make sure that BMW has a leg up in the EU. So this tension isn't really accounted for by the WTO rules in any good way, and it's what's next. It's the next big, huge challenge that has to be resolved, because countries like the European Union, like Canada, all over the world, are only going to get greener domestically, which means that this imbalance and this temptation to do the wrong thing abroad is only going to grow, and it's going to need a fix.
Are there ways our listeners can get in touch with you if they want to know more?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. My website is explaintrade.com, and I tweet at Dmitry Opines.
Thank you for listening to Global Pills. If you liked this episode, please click subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all main podcasting platforms. You can get in touch with me or propose yourself as a guest, sending an email to globalpillspodcast@gmail.com. We are also on Twitter @globalpillspod, on Instagram @GruniGlobal, Facebook, and LinkedIn.